And welcome to another episode of the SD4L show. I'm Justin Thind. I'm here today solo as my co host, Matt Sheehan, an adult with real responsibilities. So, this emergency episode to discuss the hiring of Joe Rossi as Michigan State's new defensive coordinator um, will just be me. And we will be talking about kind of what the hire means, what kind of scheme he runs, um, kind of how it came together, others that Coach Jonathan Smith had pursued, and just kind of overarching thoughts. It'll be a short, quick episode. Recording this here at 6:08 p.m. Eastern. Probably would like to get it out during or probably just after the MSU hoops game that's starting here in 20 minutes, but just going to record this real quick just so that there's some thoughts that you guys can digest tonight. So, in terms of the timeline that went into the DC search, partially that was because Jonathan Smith wanted to make sure that he was not leaving any stones unturned. He didn't want to just go ahead and only look at the people that he was familiar with, even though, as I kind of put out an article a couple weeks ago, even just the DCs that he has been familiar with, those even alone would have been some good hires. Obviously, Jimmy Lake was like the popular big name. But then Andy Avalos, Jimmy Nansen at Arizona, um, Jeff, I think it's Choate, who was at Texas as the co-DC, who was named the Nevada head coach. Those are guys that were really impressive. But beyond that, Smith wanted to look at obviously everyone's favorite big fish in Phil Parker, and he definitely did his due diligence there. Um, I guess we'll never know necessarily why Parker didn't want to make the jump, but you can probably assume 20 something, 26, 27 years at a place means way more than 4 or 5 years decades ago. So the MSU alum side of it didn't ever carry much weight for me. But the fact that maybe Iowa had been wasting his defenses the past decade and he still doesn't have a conference title despite kind of everything that he's done over there, that probably would have been a bigger reason for him to finally leave as opposed to the alum angle. But he didn't leave to go to Alabama for Nick Saban. He didn't leave to go to Michigan after Don Brown and Michigan parted ways. So he was always going to be skeptical. I was always going to be skeptical that it got done. Never really gave it much of a chance, but the fact that Smith was even talking or got him to pick up the phone means a good amount. In terms of sort of why it took long, that was a big part of it. He wanted to try to pursue a guy like a Phil Parker with the staff pool that he had, like a Jimmy Lake. But at the end of the day, just because those names were in consideration and he tried and he did his due diligence, I don't think the hire they actually made should be held in comparison to a Parker or a Lake, because other coaches at Michigan State probably would not even have tried for a Parker and a Lake, and the names never would have came up. And instead, you'd just be hiring somebody that would never be compared to somebody like that, and suddenly the hire looks much better. But like even this, like I haven't seen anything but promising kind of reception to the Rossi hire. Kind of looking around the national scope, I know Tom Fornelli of CBS Sports, he said right away after the hire that this is a big loss for Minnesota and a great hire by Jonathan Smith. Even the Minnesota fans, you can kind of see how they're feeling about it. They thought that he did a great job. There's no real bias or kind of any like wishful thinking in order to say that he's a really good DC. Now we will go ahead and we'll talk about why it might not translate as well as what he's already done. There are like things to consider in that factor. It's not a perfect hire, but I think it's about as good of a hire as Michigan State in 2023 could have made. One thing people need to understand is just because you have money to make somebody a top 8 paid defensive coordinator does not mean that one of the top 8 or 10 DCs are just going to magically say, okay, well, if you can make the money work, I'll go ahead and join you for a $200,000 raise over my current job that pays me to be the 7th best DC to now be the 4th best DC at Michigan State. Whereas I currently have my scheme humming and my trajectory is on a good spot to maybe become a head coach in a couple of years. But now let me leave all of that for a slight raise and suddenly maybe enter a rebuild where the pieces on defense aren't as maybe as reliable or stable just yet as where they currently are. and risk my trajectory to be a head coach. It doesn't matter as much about money there as it is about career trajectory. Now, Phil Parker, I don't think he's becoming a head coach. I don't think he has the intention of that. But like just generally speaking, like whoever the fifth best DC in America is, they're not looking to just suddenly uproot themselves and their trajectory and join a rebuild just because Michigan State can pay them enough to be the third highest paid DC instead of the fifth highest paid DC. Like that's not how that works at all. So Michigan State was never going to get someone that you are going to say has zero flaws. Nobody that you're going to say is a 10 out of 10 hire, even though he tried with Phil Parker. And if you take that out of it, Joe Rossi is looking like a very good hire. He had 3 top 10 defenses at Minnesota in terms of total yardage, and then 2 top 10 defenses in terms of points per game. And those the years they had top 10 in total yardage was 2019, 2021, and 2022. And then the top 10 in points was 2021 and 2022. The COVID year in 2020 and this past season were kind of his 2 worst years. But even with that, the current season that just ended, they were still top 50th percentile. They were top, I think they're 58th in the country. So even when it gets bad, it's not like bad off of a cliff kind of bad. So the things to consider though is despite him having those 10, actually, I guess before that, I should keep hitting on some of the positive points and then we'll spin over to that. But since he became the DC in 2019, full-time DC in 2019, he has put 10 guys into the NFL draft. So that is 10 defensive players only at Minnesota that have been draft picks in his time there. And that includes Antoine Winfield, who obviously very good NFL safety. He's a guy that developed talent at a place where they were not able to get that talent as ready-made recruits. Like they weren't getting 4 stars and 5 stars across the board, and yet still put guys in the NFL. You'll see coaches that maybe they'll work magic with their scheme alone and maybe not develop the talent. Like they'll get the 3 stars and they'll put together a pretty good top 25 defense, but there's not NFL guys to show for it. That's kind of a little more common. I mean, we saw it at the end of the Coach D tenure, even though obviously they did work magic for a long time with the Darqueze Denards of the world. But like if you kind of look at the very, very end, like their defenses were very good in like 2018, 2019. Like Joe Bacci, those led units, the Raekwon Williams led units, Kenny Willekes. But like out of all those guys, it was really just Josiah Scott ended up getting drafted in the 3rd or 4th round to Jacksonville, and then Kari Willis to the Colts. I'm sure I'm missing 1 or 2 guys, but like those defenses were top 10, but they were not producing talent like Minnesota's were. So my point is that there's development going on an individual basis and then collective scheme that is working out here. So that's good to see. And then most impressively in terms of a single season, to me, it's not even those 3 top 10 defenses in total yardage or the top 2 in scoring. It's actually the 2018 season where Rossi took over as the interim DC after 9 games when PJ Fleck fired his previous DC and with 4 games left in the season. Actually, let me pull up the exact stats here because that would do even more justice than kind of just winging it. Because when Rossi took over as DC, obviously with the midseason firing, that tells you how bad it was for Minnesota at the time. But it was a night and day shift when Rossi took over. And that's very hard to do midseason. So, okay, so here's where I have it. When Joe Rossi took over as DC, Minnesota was allowing 31.8 points per game and 429.3 yards per game through the first 9 games of the 2018 season. In the final 4 games when Rossi took over, Minnesota then gave up 14.8 points per game and 300 yards per game. So from 31.8 to 14.8 points per game. That was the reduction in the middle of the season with the exact same personnel 9 weeks into the season. Probably not the healthiest unit by then either. And then yardage went from 429 to 300. So to do that in the middle of a season is just that's remarkable. Because you don't have the portal, you don't have recruits coming in, you can't change the culture, you can't really change too much of the playbook. It's just simply the way that you take over and you make those changes that just really, really impresses me. So now on the other side, after singing all those praises, One thing that I know that Jonathan Smith took into account, based on kind of some of the other guys he was looking at, and um, trying to see would it be even better to get someone that did not very well statistically, but had absolutely no help in terms of offense and time of possession and all that, or Rossi, who had great defenses but was aided by time of possession and kind of that side of things. That is what brings me to the fact that I must point out that Rossi was obviously a benefactor of the Big Ten West. He was a benefactor of playing against Nebraska when they were even worse than now. Indiana, Illinois. Well, Indiana was in the East, but played a good amount of times. Illinois, Purdue had a good passing attack at times. I know Michigan State in 2021 saw that. Northwestern, Iowa's offense was not that good. So like he was aided by that, and that's where some of the top 10 defense kind of metrics come from, and also the time of possession that Minnesota had on offense. But the way that I look at it is, let's say that Rossi never touches the top 10 defense when he's at Minnesota, when he's at Michigan State. If that is extrapolated out to maybe him having the success of maybe the 28th best defense, 24th best defense, I still think it's a great hire, and I think Michigan State probably wasn't going to be able to do any better than that. He is 44 years old. He's from Pittsburgh Central Catholic. Recruits really like him. I know Brady Pretzloff, who visited Michigan State this past weekend, is a Minnesota commit. He really likes him. He's been able to get kids into the league, and that will be on his resume, and he'll be able to show that. And very personable guy. Kids really like learning from him. Obviously, if that weren't the case, you'd see more schematic issues and guys not being in the right spot on Saturdays if they didn't feel that he was a good teacher and they weren't taking to it. So at the end of the day, Rossi is, I think, and maybe an 8.8 out of 10, an 88% kind of a hire. That's better than I thought Michigan State would be able to do right now with the influx that the roster is in, and kind of, I should say, the state of flux that the roster is in. And the fact that Michigan State kind of has to reprove that they can have good defenses here, and you didn't want to have kind of a total unproven commodity trying to do that, while knowing it's also hard to have a very, very flawless, bulletproof kind of a proven candidate to come over here and leave a better situation from a talent perspective to do this. So balancing those two sides, I think it's as good of a hire as Michigan State could have gotten. We'll see what happens in terms of the actual on-field product, but all we can do today is kind of try to project it. And hey, maybe he'll be even better, and he could have a top 10 defense. Maybe it's going to be a bigger hit from going ahead and playing some harder teams than he played. Only one way to find out there. Now, in terms of scheme, I had a tweet that I kind of had poor wording there. Joe Rossi does not run a 3-4 defense. Joe Rossi has a defense where there's 3 down linemen. Now, you'd say, okay, well, doesn't that mean it's 3-4? Not necessarily. That's kind of how I worded it, because I kind of look at it as 3 down linemen, 4 people that are stand-ups. Even though 3 are at the second level, I'd still like call that a 3-4. But talking to Stephen Brooks, Corey Robinson, Alan True, the way that it should have been more accurately described was in perspective to the way that the scheme of, or the gap scheme, is set up. So in Rossi's defense, even though it's 3 down linemen, those 3 down linemen are not arranged in a way where they are kind of having a nose tackle over the center and 2 kind of wide stretched 3-4 defensive ends of the 3-4 measurable mold. That's not what's happening here. Rossi's defense has 2 regular traditional 4-3 kind of defensive tackles in terms of measurables wise, and in terms of where they're lining up. They're lining up just like DTs would in a 4-3 defense. And then on one side of those 2 traditional defensive tackles is a traditional 4-3 defensive end with his hand in the dirt. And then on the other side, the stand-up rusher, he is not necessarily a linebacker in terms of responsibilities, and probably not even in terms of measurables, even though I think the kid's about 245, 248 when I check the roster. So like he's not big by any means, but they're lined up in terms of a gap scheme where it would be the same thing as an even format front. So really, if the offensive line has to block for and scheme against the same alignment as a traditional 4 people having hands in the dirt kind of a scheme, it should be called a 4-man front. I shouldn't have said he runs a 3-4. So I did want to clear that up. But yeah, so 4 guys at the line of scrimmage, 3 guys with their hands in the dirt, but 4 guys that fit the same personnel as what Michigan State had in their front 4. On third down, though, a lot of creative stuff. You see some 3-2-6, you see some 4-2-5. You just pretty much see everything. There's a lot of chaos going on with the way that they attack third down, the blitzes that they come up with. Just kind of they create chaos and wreak havoc for the quarterback from a mental picture standpoint before the snap, after the snap. Now that doesn't mean that Rossi just sits there and comes up with crazy blitzes all day and he just blitzes left and right. It is pretty much the same philosophy that every single defensive coordinator at high level football in 2023 tries to adhere to, and that's where you make a quarterback throw more passes over a drive, the more likely they are to create a turnover for you. And the more likely you are to eventually get him to get confused or see something that he shouldn't be seeing and throw a pick. Whereas instead of the Don Brown pressing at the line of scrimmage, always playing press man, blitzing, not having help over the top, that's not what you really see NFL or college football defenses do these days. I know at times, like Scotty Hazelton's defense, especially against Washington 2 years ago and Ohio State every year, it looked bad because they were never actually getting to that point where the defense would cause a turnover. If your whole entire plan here is, all right, we're going to make this quarterback throw the ball 8 times and it's going to be a 13-play scoring drive if they're going to score on us, and you're never generating a turnover in those 13 plays or in those 8 throws, then you repeatedly are failing at your core principle of we're going to have a greater sample size so that we are giving ourselves a greater opportunity for them to eventually make a mistake. And in college, it works especially well because quarterbacks don't have the attention span to always hit the check down or always make the safe play 13 plays down the field. And what happens is that if you have a good defensive coordinator and let's say on first down, it's a 1st and 10 run up the middle for a gain of 3 yards at the 50-yard line. Second play, it's a incompletion because the quarterback decided to try to push one of the boundaries where he shouldn't be because the zone was set up well. Now you're at 3rd and 7. Now that Scotty Hazelton was able to get Michigan State into 3rd and 7s all the time. The scheme was working to get that to be the case quite often. But the difference between the good defensive coordinator and the bad one is once your scheme gets you into that ability to get the defense off the field because of you forcing the quarterbacks to either have incompletions because they're not taking the safe play, or whether it's just those safe plays that led to it being 3rd and 4 just because the yardage they were getting on each play was shorter. Once you get them into that spot, that's where you have to get off the field. That's where Rossi makes the difference on 3rd down, where sure, it might have been an easy slant that got 5 yards on the first play, and then maybe a gain of 1 on a halfback dive up the middle on the next play. Sure, those might have been easy 6 yards to get on them, which they really aren't easy to get on them based on the stats you see. But I'm just saying, like, in the worst case scenario of how that defense is supposed to work, of sure, those are easy. 3rd down, when you have your chaos looks and the quarterback doesn't know what he's seeing, that's where you capitalize on that. And if you have a drive where it's 4 different sets of downs, right, and you're seeing 3rd down 3 times, you have to be an elite quarterback to every single one of those times continue to make the correct play. And that is how the bend, not break defense works ideally. And that's how the Chiefs and the Eagles played, and they got them to the Super Bowl. Now we saw them get shredded in the Super Bowl. That's just because offenses are beating defenses in this era of football. But like the best teams at the best levels of football run this defense where they're not press manning on 1st and 10, 2nd and 10, and just trying to get turnovers on 1st down, 2nd down. They're baiting their time. They're making sure that the quarterback has to actually think multiple times on the drive, throughout the drive. And that is the way that pretty much all defenses these days are set up. So he's not unique in that sense. Joe Rossi, like everybody else, takes a logical approach to defense, just like everyone else kind of views it. But where he's different is on 3rd down, his chaos looks. That's where it separates. That's where he separates himself. So from a scheme standpoint, sure, 3 down linemen, but should be calling it a 4-man front. In terms of the linebackers at the second level, like sure they have 3 linebackers when they play on like 1st and 10 or like a 3rd and 2 or something like that, but 3rd and 13, no, you're going to probably see 4-2-5, or if there's 4 receivers on the field on 2nd and 10, you're going to see a 4-2-5, if not even a dime look. So yeah, the linebacker number, like you can call it a 4-3, you can call it a 4-2-5. Probably a 4-3 is what you should say, because on a 1st and 10, a lot of times you do see a 4-3. You see a 4-3 personnel in terms of their snap counts as being probably the most high. Just quickly scrolling through PFF snap counts and how many linebackers played. So yeah, sure, 4-3 if that makes you comfortable. But again, it's dictated by the amount of receivers that the defense has on the field. But one thing I will say is that in the 4-3, they're not in a rush to switch to the 4-2-5 just because there's one extra receiver on the field. They're okay with their linebacker stepping out there and covering. So Michigan State doesn't really have any good coverage linebackers really on the whole roster. I know Jordan Hall did admirably when he was asked to do it, but he more so looked good doing it just because of what the rest of the roster looked like. His strengths were still run defense and kind of being in the box. So he, like, again, like you have to get more guys that can cover in space. So maybe it'll take a year or two for the defense to look good, but that's not because of scheme. That's not because of Rossi. It's just because that's what the rooms look like on the defense right now. But yeah, so Rossi, good hire, I would say. Um, we'll see what this means in terms of how they approach the next week or so of maybe now they pick up some portal traction with some guys. Maybe they just pick up the pace with kind of their pursuits, things of that nature. But I know Brady Pretzloff, he visited even without knowing who the DC and linebackers coach were. I can't imagine this would hurt him, but looks like Michigan State got a good DC here, and we'll see what happens on the field. But appreciate everyone for tuning in. That's all for this brief episode. One thing I will say, like I always do, please press subscribe. Please comment. Please like. You guys usually do a good job with the comments, but the likes and the subscriptions, especially the subscriptions, we will always take. We will always take more because the views are always superseding the amount of subscriptions. And as I always say, the math is not adding up. So with that, appreciate you guys joining. We'll have another episode sometime later this week. We'll be probably talking about official visits and hopefully some good news by then. Everything seems to have been trending the way it was supposed to with all the recruits that visited this past weekend. So we'll see where that takes us. But appreciate everyone tuning in. I'm Justin Thin. And go check out all our content over on 247sports.com on the Spartan Tailgate Michigan State site. We'll have much more on Rossi over there, but appreciate everyone for tuning in. Thanks.